In the heart of 18th century Europe, a time when monarchs ruled with iron fists, when the church dictated the boundaries of thought, and when dissent often meant imprisonment or worse, one man dared to raise his voice against the tides of ignorance and oppression. His name was François-Marie Hirault, though the world would come to know him by a single word that struck fear in the hearts of kings and priests alike: Voltaire. He was not a conqueror on the battlefield, nor a ruler of nations, but his pen carried more power than any sword. Through satire, wit, and relentless courage, he challenged the very foundations of tyranny, superstition, and blind obedience. Voltaire's life is the story of rebellion against injustice, the story of a man who used words as weapons and laughter as a shield, the story of how one thinker illuminated the path toward freedom in an age of darkness. To understand Voltaire is to understand the spirit of the Enlightenment, that great intellectual revolution which reshaped Europe and laid the foundations of the modern world. But Voltaire was not born into greatness. His journey was a struggle, a fight against authority, exile, censorship, and even prison. What makes him remarkable is that, despite every attempt to silence him, he always came back louder, sharper, and more determined. He was the rebel who enlightened Europe. Voltaire's story begins in Paris in 1694. Born into a middle-class family, young François-Marie showed from an early age an unusual gift with words. While other children memorized prayers, he was already composing verses. His sharp tongue, however, soon became both his strength and his curse. Parisian society was enchanted by his wit, but authorities found it dangerous. By the time he was in his 20s, he was already imprisoned in the Bastille, the dreaded fortress where dissenters were locked away. What was his crime? He had written verses mocking the regent of France. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. Voltaire spoke the truth, the powerful grew offended, and he was punished. Yet, instead of breaking his spirit, prison sharpened his resolve. It was in the Bastille that François-Marie decided to adopt the name by which history would remember him, a Voltaire. This name was more than a pseudonym. It was a declaration of independence, a symbol of his rebirth as a writer who would never bow to authority. Exile soon followed. Banished from Paris, Voltaire spent time in England, and this exile became one of the most transformative experiences of his life. In England, he encountered a society where philosophers like John Locke and scientists like Isaac Newton flourished, where newspapers openly criticized the government, and where intellectuals debated ideas with freedom unimaginable in France. Voltaire admired the relative liberty of England, its respect for science, and its tolerance of different religious views. He studied Newton's physics, Locke's philosophy, and Shakespeare's plays, absorbing their lessons like a sponge. When he eventually returned to France, he carried with him a vision of what society could be: free, rational, and enlightened. He began writing works that shook the foundations of European thought. His letters on England introduced the French to the radical ideas of English philosophy, praising tolerance, freedom of speech, and scientific progress. Predictably, the French authorities banned the book and ordered it burned. But the flames of censorship could not consume Voltaire's ideas. The more they tried to silence him, the more people wanted to read him. Voltaire had become a voice of reason in a world drowning in superstition. Voltaire's greatest weapon was his pen, and he wielded it with unmatched brilliance. He wrote plays, poems, novels, and essays that entertained while provoking thought. He understood something profound: laughter could dismantle tyranny more effectively than anger. His wit was razor-sharp, his satire merciless. In his most famous work, Candide, he used humor to expose the absurdity of blind optimism, mocking the belief that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Through the misadventures of the naive Candide, Voltaire revealed the cruelty of war, the hypocrisy of religion, and the corruption of rulers. Candide was banned almost everywhere, yet it spread across Europe like wildfire. People laughed at its humor, but they also recognized the serious truths hidden beneath its comedy. This was Voltaire's genius. He could make you laugh while planting seeds of doubt against injustice. But Voltaire was not merely a writer of satire. He was also a defender of human rights before the concept even had a name. He fought tirelessly for justice in specific cases where ordinary people had been crushed by the machinery of power. One of the most famous was the case of Jean Collars, a Protestant wrongly accused of murdering his son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Collars was tortured and executed, a victim of religious fanaticism. Outraged, Voltaire launched a campaign to clear his name. Through pamphlets, petitions, and relentless appeals, Voltaire exposed the injustice and eventually succeeded in overturning the verdict posthumously. He did not stop there. He became the champion of the oppressed, denouncing torture, religious persecution, and arbitrary imprisonment. In these moments, Voltaire was more than a philosopher. He was an activist, showing that ideas were not just for the page but for the defense of real human lives. Voltaire's battle was not against religion itself but against its abuses. He famously declared, "Écrasez l'infâme." Crush the infamous thing, referring to fanaticism, superstition, and the corruption of organized religion. He did not seek to erase faith but to liberate it from cruelty and dogma. For him, true religion meant tolerance, kindness, and humility, not the burning of heretics or the silencing of doubt. His advocacy of religious tolerance was revolutionary in an age when Europe was still scarred by centuries of religious wars. Voltaire envisioned a world where Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and freethinkers could coexist in peace. In many ways, his vision prefigured the modern principles of secularism and pluralism. Yet, Voltaire's life was not without contradictions. He was wealthy, often living in luxury, and he sought the patronage of kings and nobles even as he criticized them. He craved recognition as much as he craved justice. But perhaps it was this blend of pragmatism and idealism that allowed him to survive in a dangerous world. Unlike some philosophers who were executed or forgotten, Voltaire navigated the perils of censorship with cunning. He published anonymously, spread his works through underground networks, and always managed to stay one step ahead of his enemies. His survival was itself a kind of victory, for it meant that his voice continued to reach the people. As Voltaire grew older, his influence only expanded. His estate at Ferney became a beacon of enlightenment, attracting visitors from across Europe who came to hear his wisdom. He corresponded with monarchs like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, advising them on reforms. Though he often criticized rulers, he also believed that enlightened monarchs could use their power to bring progress. This belief in an enlightened despotism was controversial, but it reflected Voltaire's practical side. He did not dream of overthrowing monarchies, he dreamed of reforming them with reason. In 1778, at the age of 83, Voltaire returned to Paris in a triumphant moment. After decades of exile and censorship, he was welcomed as a hero. Crowds cheered him in the streets, theaters honored him, and intellectuals hailed him as the voice of the Enlightenment. But the triumph was short-lived. Just months later, Voltaire died. Yet, even in death, he refused to be silenced. His works lived on, inspiring revolutions and shaping the modern ideals of liberty, equality, and human rights. When the French Revolution erupted just over a decade later, Voltaire's spirit was everywhere. Revolutionaries carried his writings as weapons against tyranny, and his remains were enshrined in the Pantheon in Paris, a temple of heroes. Voltaire's legacy is vast. He helped break the chains of dogma and superstition, encouraging people to think for themselves. He showed that laughter could be revolutionary, that words could topple empires, and that one individual armed with courage and wit could change the course of history. Today, when we speak freely, when we challenge authority, when we defend tolerance, we are walking in Voltaire's footsteps. His life reminds us that freedom is never given, it must be demanded, defended, and spoken into existence. Voltaire was not perfect, but he was relentless. He was not always consistent, but he was always courageous. He was the rebel who enlightened Europe, and his fire continues to burn wherever the human spirit seeks liberty. And so, when we reflect on Voltaire's journey, we see more than just a man of words. We see a warrior of truth, a defender of the oppressed, and a dreamer of a world ruled by reason. His pen may have been his only weapon, but it proved mightier than the armies of kings. The enlightenment that he helped ignite still lives in our institutions, our freedoms, and our values. It is the light we carry against the shadows of ignorance, intolerance, and tyranny. Voltaire's nightmare was a world where people bowed blindly to authority. His dream was a world where they thought for themselves. And in many ways, that dream still guides us today.